Welcome, everybody. My name is Michael Keith from the University of Oxford. Welcome to the webinar, Shaping Urban Futures, New Ideas, Better Practices. The webinar today has two dimensions to it. The first of which is to celebrate the fact that we are now available globally to anybody who wishes to join the course, the Shaping Urban Futures course, both on the Coursera platform, but also adopted by the UN SDG Academy. Please let everybody you know who enjoys these webinars and the course know that the links, if you look in the chat, you'll see the connections to the course. The second purpose of our webinar today is to launch a global report from the Peak Urban program of work. Peak Urban is a collaboration that has been going on for the last 5 years across 5 countries. It is a program of work that tries to shape urban futures, by thinking about how we link research practice to real life circumstances. And in the global report that you can also see a link in your chat online to, so please download and have a look. We outline both the ways in which we address this major challenge, both what we describe as a peak urban disposition and a peak urban approach to thinking about cities. When we talk about a disposition, what we try and say is that the program of work that we've engaged in thinks analytically about the way cities works. It actually thinks about how urban futures that shape the majority of humanity in decades to come will also invoke and demand normative decisions in terms of the trade-offs between different ways of thinking about the good city. But also all of us as scholars, as activists, as NGO members, as city government officials, need to think about the operational space in which we might be most effective, whether it's at the level of the neighborhood or in the town hall or in the ivory tower. So our disposition combines that sense of the analytical, the normative, and the operational space. And the peak urban approach comes from the simple acronym PEAK, which outlines the ways in which our work that is in, with, and on cities has actually tried to combine different forms of scholarship, very embedded in different places to make a difference, but also combining the P, which represents our attempts to predict and replicate forms of urban science in different places, that acknowledges that when we're thinking about cities, they're where newness comes into the world, new forms of urban life, new cultures, new ways of organizing the economy and society. So the E is for emergence, particularly in systems that we know are complex. Cities are systems of systems, we know if you have studied the course already. But also they're systems that are disrupted by technological change, and technological change is adopted very differently in different places, which gives us the A of adoption of our acronym. But we also know that for science, for knowledge, for research to make a difference, we need to bring together the people who are involved in cities, the grassroots of the cities, along with the forms of governance. It depends on knowledge exchange, the K of the acronym PEAK. So in trying to think through that peak urban approach, we in the report outline the ways we draw together the P, the E, the A, and the K in the report. And so today in our panel, I've got 6 fantastic colleagues who've been working together over the last 5 years from different parts of the world. We have Andrew Tucker from the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, Nevo Cleary from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore, Pongjun Zhao from Beijing Dashway, Peking University, and Juan Carlos Duque from Airfield Universidad in Medellin, and Sue Parnell also from the African Centre for Cities at Cape Town, but also at Bristol. And we're going to be running through a conversation between people on the panel, but also we really welcome some questions from people in the audience. And we've already had some questions coming forward, so please put questions in the chat as they come up. But the first question I just want to ask the panel is whether they might give us a favorite example of work that they did on the program that's fed into the global report that we've done. and actually particularly think about the ways it made a difference to the cities where you are working, and how it actually thought through that sense of an urban disposition, a peak urban approach. And we're going to kick off with Andy and then move to Niamh and then Pongjun. To begin with, Andy, please, and welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's an interesting question because it's very hard to pick a favorite example for the series of the 5 projects that actually took place at the University of Cape Town at the African Centre for Cities. Each one of them in very different ways spoke to the peak urban disposition. And I think that that's one of the strengths of what peak urban was, in the sense that it allowed a very dialectical mode of engagement between what particular country partners had interests in and saw as particular urban problematics, and the overarching framework that then allowed particular country partners to speak back to other partners and to the program as a whole. So it's kind of hard to pick a favorite, because you're kind of worried you're going to annoy the other projects by not picking them as a favorite. But one example that I think I can highlight is some work that James Duminy and Susan Parnell actually did in relation to what is termed in South Africa the City Support Program, which is an initiative run by National Treasury. And this, again, I think speaks very much to the uniqueness of South African urban development, because National Treasury, rather than other line departments within the national government, have significant oversight in terms of the role of supporting cities to develop and to become more equitable. The reason why I think this example, although not a favorite, I think does nevertheless speak to many of the interests in peak urban is because, you know, just as all the projects did, but just focusing on this one for now, it really spoke across sectors. So it was really trying to understand the history But to quote the old adage, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. It was very much about trying to understand why things had got to where they are now. And the reason why I think this was so important in the context of the 8 main municipal governments in South Africa is that there has obviously been radical change, radical shifts over the past 50, 100 years in the context of South Africa, from colonial and apartheid rule to the post-apartheid dispensation. And sometimes I think, you know, government officials aren't aware of the history as to why things have got to how they are. And so to actually support city governance and to support decision-making now, it was very important to create a very rich text and a very detailed text that really explained why the current situation existed, as much as it was to present possible solutions in the future, taking into account emerging technologies, new data science, and the emergence of new urban forms. Thanks. So, yeah, that's what I'll say for that.
Thanks, Andy. To Niamh, I should say that all of this work is available on the Peak Urban website, and so please have a look. You'll also see in the chat a link to that website. Niamh, how about yourself?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael. So I think you froze very briefly during the introduction, so I'll just say that I'm from University College London, and I was the lead of the sort of mathematics and data science team based out of Oxford for Peak Urban. And so I think when I thought about this question, what really popped into my mind was a project that was actually entirely unplanned. So as many of you listening may be aware, that of course, how people move in cities and how they interact with each other is sort of a keen topic of interest, particularly for those using sort of big data sets, and that has really exploded in the last years. And so access to these type of data sets is really very valuable for urban research. And so as part of Peak Urban, we had been spending quite a long time, up to a year, securing access to mobile phone data for Colombian cities through Spanish Telefonica, influence on mobility. And so what we found, which was completely contrary to what people expected at the time, now it's less surprising, but at the time it was very surprising, was that if you increase the severity of your lockdown rules, and you had people effectively prevented from leaving their houses, you know, to a much higher degree, you actually didn't necessarily decrease mobility. what it turned out that the decrease in mobility was almost exclusively explained by socioeconomic status, the wealth of the city, the wealth of the people. And this was very important for policymakers, right? Because they were, tweaking lockdown rules, thinking about how to help people. And of course, they expected at the time that the more severe the rule, the greater the decrease in mobility. And so that was an opportunity that came about as part of, some peak groundwork we were laying. It wasn't planned or expected, but it ended up being probably one of the more exciting and dynamic and impactful projects that we undertook as part of peak.
Brilliant, Niamh. Thanks. I mean, that is a real sense of kind of invention, imagination, and recognizing the diversity of cities, but also the replicability of some of the procedures we use to make sense of them. So, Pangjun, do you want to say a little bit more? Because I think there'll be some similarities there in your work.
Yeah, that's good. So, hello everyone. It's a very it's good chance to share some of my ideas about the peak urban with our global audience. I would say this is very good, opportunity to work on this project. And also I have been trying hard to implement research and theoretical output in practice. There's an example, last year I started to work a project with Shenzhen municipal government. Shenzhen is very close to Hong Kong, and also it's one of the most green fast cities in China. Since 40 years ago, there was a small fish village. There probably 100, 200 people, but now it's almost 20 million people in that city. So the city grew very, very fast. And then, we cannot serve the city's problems by city itself. We need, take regional action. That means this city need to cooperate with the neighbor cities. So, but there's a problem is coming how the city government, between from different cities, they can agree each other. So that's I think there's a big two big challenges. One is how we can build the good transport between this city and that city, because it's a very big challenge at the moment, because most of the money so sometimes it comes from cities individually. So how they can cooperate together, in particular for the public transport, for metro lines or intracity or railway system. And then, that's a big challenge. So, but we talk with government and how they can, how encourage, they can sit down together and collaborate with each other. And I would say this, we wrote a consulting report to the city government. And I would say it's good they include my suggestions and my thoughts in the latest urban planning document. The second challenge is biggest in China cities, the housing prices, just increase very, very fast. So that means, in Shenzhen, many low and middle income workers, they have to live in other cities. That means they spend lots of time in commuting every day. So how we can treat these things and to build some more equality cities for everyone, particularly for these low-income workers who live very far from this city. And then we think we should build more inclusive transport system together with transport system, put these housing and transport systems together. And then we wrote another document to the local government. They think probably it's a good way to put all things together. That's our peak key principle. We need to take the city as a whole system, because the housing problem always related to transport problem always related to the cities. But from my experiences, it's very good to apply peak urban knowledge in transferring our theoretical ideas into the local government practices. That's for me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pangjun. We'll just move on to Gautam and then to Juan Carlos. Gautam.
Sorry, that just unmuted. I think for me, there were two projects that were very key. In the Indian urban context, we struggle very deeply with not having the granularity of data that we need to be able to be analytically sharp about our cities. A lot of Indian cities have no data at the neighborhood or household scale available to researchers. And this basically means that in large megacities or in small towns, we're often flying blind. And the second thing that makes our data very complicated is particular forms of distance and visibility from the state, say of informal workers or informal enterprises that form the backbone of our economic infrastructure, but are by definition just in some sort of tension with visibility. These are not hidden or invisible, but there's certainly places where they are very hard to enumerate for reasons sometimes that protect them. So it's not entirely sure that visibility is a very contested terrain. But two of our projects, one led by Shreya Anand and one by Krishna Balachandran, colleagues of mine, used these ways to understand the economic geography of Bangalore. One of them tried to combine economic data sets with voting data jurisdictions to find another way to granularly map small economic enterprises that drive our cities are very absent from our maps and then therefore absent from our policy imaginations. And seeing that map for the first time for me was really striking because it actually showed us a very different economic geography of a city like Bangalore, which people associate very quickly with information technology. And that large spatial footprint of IT or an older spatial footprint of garment, say, is very visible in Bangalore. So we organize the economic geography in the city according to that. But when these informal, small nano enterprises show up that have, 6, 7, 2, 8 workers that are not none of these large sets, you start seeing spatial clustering in the city of a completely different logic. It's sort of senses of where the city produces, where it works, and where the enterprise is coming from really changes. And what's striking is that when you think of sort of, say, the industrial policy of the city or a planning for economic infrastructure, these are not the neighborhoods you're thinking about. You're thinking of your IT parks and your economic zones and your corridors and your highways and your transit-oriented development and your known 80s industrial area. This is not that geography. So here's a geography that's come up in a way despite the state, but is vibrant and strong. And one of the difficulties to argue for it is to make its geography visible. So we sometimes would have these numbers because an argument for economic protection may be enough just to know they exist. But an argument for infrastructure and economic infrastructure planning requires a geography. So to me, seeing that map that my colleagues managed to pull together by putting the strangest data sets together was exactly that kind of exploratory analytical work that I think that peak sort of pushed us to do. And there's nothing better when your research makes you see a city that you think you know in a very sudden new light. So that was a very nice moment.
Thanks, Gautam and Juan Carlos.
And Michael, so happy to be here with my colleagues from PIC in this celebration, launching the global report, the mood. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm like Andy, it's difficult to select a favorite project, but I'm not being polite. It's just we made beautiful pieces of research during those 5 years. But I'm gonna talk about one, this model in which we develop this project in which we develop a model for urban growth prediction, urban growth and population distribution. And the motivation was this, most of the fast urban growth that is coming is gonna be faced by cities that currently don't have the capabilities to plan for that growth. So it's very likely that urban planners on those cities won't be well prepared for dealing with that challenge. And although there are models for predicting urban growth, they are very demanding in terms of the data. You need like highly qualified human capital to be able to apply those models, and that's difficult for those cities. So we decided to develop this model that uses freely available data, satellite images, and combine that with the state of the art in artificial intelligence. And we developed this model for predicting urban growth in those environments with scarcity of data. And you can use that model everywhere in the world. And in fact, the largest utility company in Colombia is currently using that model to predict urban growth in areas in which they don't have the data. And they use it to predict the future consumption of water on those areas, and so that they can better plan the deployment of pipelines to supply that water in the future in a more efficient way, so that that infrastructure is going to be more efficient and is going to cost less to the people. We also use that model with colleagues from China to assess the impact of different policies for water protection and the impact of those policies in urban growth. So I think that's a really good example that combine most, if not all, the elements that you, Michael, mentioned about PIC, using new sources of data, a multidisciplinary approach to a global problem, creating tools that are replicable and scalable. So I would choose that experience as my favorite example. And if the audience wants to know more about that, you have the report and the MOOC. We talk about that in the MOOC. So I invite the people to take a look to that material also.
Brilliant. Thanks, Swan. I mean, it actually leads me on, because hopefully that gives our audience a flavor of the diversity of the work we did, but also that sensibility that tries to work across different scholarly traditions, but also is what we call translational. All of the work that you just heard about made a difference on the ground in terms of the way key people thought about and acted in the cities and changed the cities we are working in. But obviously the other dimension that we are working with, as you can see, is collaborations across countries between partners. And so I suppose my next question to the panel, and I'll come back to you, Juan, first, if you like to follow on from what you were just saying, because it's quite close, is what do you gain? What's the benefit of working across international boundaries in this way when we're thinking about cities? Because we're most concerned very often with the cities we live, or the cities in the countries where we live, but we tried to work across international boundaries. What did that bring to your way of thinking and acting?
Yeah, it's difficult to summarize that in a few minutes, but I'm going to picture to the audience like two scenarios. Our research group, RISE, before PIC, okay? A bunch of talented guys looking for local problems so that we can like do research that with some impact, contribute to local challenges, and then try to publish those findings in international journals. Okay, that was RISE before PIC. Now, RISE within the PIC project. So you find a local problem, okay? Then you take that local problem and you share that problem with a network of people from different disciplines and different cultures and different countries all around the world. And then when you see that local problem through the lens of multidisciplinarity, you realize that your local problem, it may be a variation of a global problem, you know, and that if you better understand that local problem, is helping you actually to better understand a global challenge. So like now a local problem is contributing to a way more like a bigger purpose, like trying to contribute to the theory. So now the problems have like a theoretical foundation, very like more robust. And then you generate with that network more integral solutions to that problem. So you can have, again, like solutions that you can apply in not only in your local problem, but in other places around the world. So having access to that network allow us to, for example, work with medical doctors and epidemiologists to assess the relationship between urban form and health, or work with architects to combine satellite images and image processing with Lefebvre theory of production of space to have better ideas about how to integrate migrants to the city and have new models for social housing, or better models for social housing, or work with civil engineers to use images at the street level to better assess the quality of like residential infrastructure, or to have a better idea about the commercial spatial distribution of commercial activity. So like having access to the PIC network just help us to think bigger and have a greater impact through our research.
Thanks, Juan. And I suppose of all of our team, Sue is working at the University of Bristol, but also is connected still to African Centre for Cities at the same time. So, Sue, how did you see that those international links working?
Yeah, well, Michael, I mean, I think I had a slightly different role in PEAK in addition to a grounded set of research. I was also involved in an explicit objective for the program to build a global cohort of leaders. And I think that what that meant and why that's so important is that it's only when you know something about somebody else's city that you can begin to see your own city slightly differently.
I mean, these are young researchers, right, working in that.
Well, you know each other and you've met each other, and we were fortunate enough to have spent some time in each other's cities, listening to people describing their places in ways that they thought would make the urban problems and the urban issues legible to us. And I think it's both in the act, as Gautam was saying, is when you're asked to look at your own city with a different question in mind, or to speak about your city, as Juan was saying, in order to make it a generalizable pattern that you are expressing, or a mode of research that you're expressing, you come to know yourself very much better. Okay, so I think that's the first thing which I think was crucial to have an international audience. I also think that methodologically, if you took two data scientists, one working in Colombia, one working in South Africa, or one working in India, they encounter different problems. And so methodologically, there's a bit of a rub up and a bit of a lesson learning just from the cross-geographical and the global composite. But there's another dimension which I think was also helpful, and in a way we're participating in that right now. We didn't anticipate the pandemic, and we didn't want it, and it was very inconvenient for us in many ways. But what it did force was a global dialogue online in a way that wasn't possible before. And I think that we've been able to use that. We were able to run some of our own internal meetings online in ways that I think privileged people who wouldn't always have spoken in the same way, would have privileged a very different kind of preparation and conversation. And the MOOC and this kind of seminar, I think, do exactly the same way. And just on that, as I know there's a very visible thing of the people who are on the panel, and you can see us and you've been told where we're from, lovely questions coming in. When you introduce yourself on the questions, always put where you're from as well, okay? In other words, people begin to see your name. They begin to say, oh, no, Raphael, didn't you ask that really interesting question in the panel on the PEAK stuff? I wonder where he is now. Then people can follow up with you. You can begin to have an online kind of conversation. And it's that dialogue about cities, shifting our head on how we talk, what we talk about, and what is important in how we speak, that I think we've actually made really great strides on, because we're not from the same place. And in a way, our ideological and our philosophical and perhaps even our political positions are a little more muted, and we're able to have some more general conversations, which is not to say those are unimportant things, but the global conversation facilitates a set of issues which are, I think, Juan, you said, when you're involved in the micro, you get very absorbed in it and it's very exciting, but it has its limits. So to have both has been incredible.
Thank you, Sue. How does that work for you, Gautam?
I think, I won't repeat a lot of what Juan and Sue said, but I think they resonate with me very much. I think for me, one of the most important things was to sort of also be a little bit less wary about what it means to work across geographical context. I think sometimes working internationally can feel very forbidding. You feel like you have to know that much about China and that much about South Africa and that much about Colombia. There was a whole set of folks where you need this. And a lot of the younger researchers in our team actually felt, like Sue was saying, initially quite hesitant. You would say, well, what right do I have to speak of a place if I don't know it in this depth, right? And I think one of the things that I really took away from Peak is that conversation can begin at multiple levels. A comparative gesture is as useful intellectually in terms of at least raising new questions. So if we're not looking for complete structural formed ideas to move from place to place, which is that horrific best practice model copy paste thing that often happens. But if we're looking for ways of thinking and methods and conversations and gestures, actually you can begin internationalizing much earlier in your life, much earlier in your intellectual life. And you can do it without having the money or the opportunity necessarily to go everywhere. And that's what the pandemic also taught us. Conversation can hold a comparative gesture. And all of us got very good at backgrounding exactly what we needed to background and not worrying about that broader. It's a real skill to be able to say, here's what you need to know about my context so that we can have this conversation together. So I think that for me, in addition to what they were saying, I'd add this element that to not wait for a certain threshold or an experience or a complexity before one dares to think comparatively. It's free. You can start doing it now. And at worst, you'll learn along as you go. But I would encourage all the folks who took the course, all the folks who are listening to this conversation today, it can only grow you intellectually from where you are. And you can start asking questions much sooner than one can find more concrete things to say across context. So that part was, I think, for me, that abiding memory, in addition to this ability to look at one's own context in a very different way, like I said in the first question. To me, the whole point of comparison is to come home. It's a little bit like good travel. You're very happy you saw other things, but all the fun of it is your eyes when you come back. That's, to me, the thing.
Absolutely. So it seems as though you're saying we need to look up close and see from a distance simultaneously, but also recognize that when we see things that are similar, they are very often very different. And conversations actually surface that very often. But it's really powerful.
Just to see how people react when you say something is a lot.
Neve, and then Pungjun will come back as well. Neve, how would it make a difference to you, those international links?
Yeah, I guess I would first, before answering that question, I'd take a step back and I'd explain to our audience that Peak was quite unusual within this sort of context of large UK grants. So quite often with grants, more generally, what is going to happen in the grant is spelled out quite well beforehand. So quite often there's, the more senior academics, they have a pretty good idea of what questions they want to ask. And the idea is to hire more junior academics who will, to some extent, carry out those projects. They'll have a role in deciding how to do it and the specifics, but quite often the projects are, the questions are preset. But that was completely not the case with Peak, right? So Peak was specifically about, as Sue was mentioning, about fostering, a large cohort of kind of urban leaders, but it also was very open-ended, right? So we hired a large cohort of researchers at different career stages, and we said, well, we have this big network, and we have this big, very geographically diverse, but also disciplinarily diverse group of people, and we want you to go and find projects, and we want you to collaborate across borders. And that's actually a really, really hard thing to ask people to do. Even specifically in my team, I had mathematicians mainly, some of whom are actually, and so Raphael are on the call here today, right? And although Raphael previously had experience in this type of space, many of my other research had no experience at all. They came from, pure mathematics PhDs. And so that's a really hard thing to ask researchers to do, is go and, find really good questions with people located in different places, often doing quite different things. And I think that process of discovery, that really hard path that, you know, a lot of the researchers spent a good part of the first year on, was quite transformative for the cohort in general, because being able to sniff out a good question and build partnerships and build tricky partnerships at sometimes with people doing very different things is something that I think as we mentioned earlier, there's been a huge growth in the cohort, and a lot of partnerships and long-term partnerships have been built, right, that are ongoing now. And so I guess the legacy I see from Peak is a huge growth in terms of the research teams being able to ask good questions and generate these really impressive partnerships, but also there's an ongoing legacy of that lots and lots of people in the group are still working together and still putting in grant applications and, you know, all sorts of things, you know, even today.
Thanks. And Pengjun, how is it from China?
Yeah, from China, I think this particular, I would say for China cities, probably we need to keep a very strong international links. And yeah, it's you know, before the COVID-19 period, every year this for myself, I attend a lot of international conference. But it's in the past 3 years, that's something happening. Pandemic has stopped some international events, communications, but it's okay. I would say actually that's from my experiences, you know, I learned a lot from the peak urban sense, you know, well, we need to keep very strong international links. That's very important. You know, I collaborate with, you know, Michael and our peak urban group, and also collaborate with some colleagues from New Zealand, from World Bank. I would say there's many benefits. Firstly, I want to see, you know, we always, as researchers, we always want our knowledge can be generalized. I fully agree with, you know, Susan that. And we, you know, so it's different cities, they are developing in the different stages. And particularly for most of the cities in China, they are still in a rapid urbanization stage. The city is growing, that keep growing, you know. In other places in the rest of the world, the cities look like, you know, become the mature. And so I try to, you know, it's good way to generalize our knowledge of how city, you know, development or you know, evolve. Just talk with our collaborate with our international you know, partners. I think that's the first thing, you know, it's a knowledge generation. The second thing is, you know, we need to think about our cities globally, because the cities are not connected between each other. You know, the cities are not individual things. You know, particularly in the such in the moment, you know, because of globalization, financing things, the new technicals, let's make the cities they connect or they linked, you know, together. So that's, you know, just like a global village, just like this. You know, we need to think about globally. For example, climate change. You know, for the if we do the low carbon cities, we need to think about globally. That means we need to, you know, collaborate with our international partners. And another thing is, you know, for some new technicals, for example, artificial intelligence. And last year, I remember I attended an international conference. It's mainly focused on how AI, artificial intelligence technicals can be used to support our research in urban science or our policy making decisions. You know, how we can use that to make our policy more efficiently. I think all these good topics that's making we need to think globally. You know, we at this moment or the next 20 or 30 years, I would see this requirement will become stronger and stronger. So the last benefits, I would say, there's a lot of benefits. You know, I collaborate with my international partners. We apply draw to this project together. And we particularly is a good way to keep very strong internet links for PhD students, because the future belongs to them. And we need training them as some young researchers who can think globally. So I think this is very important. And for the peak urban example, we already educated some at least for 5 PhD students. They did exchange between the UK and the Peking University, particularly Oxford University. I think this is a good way to keep. So yeah, there's lots of benefits. I would say I look forward to more.
I think that's really helpful. I think that's really helpful, Peng Zhen. Obviously, we all follow the mantra that we hope to leave the city better when we leave the planet than when we arrive in the place. So it actually takes us on to the question of sustainability, really, which is why I'm really pleased that we are also celebrating today the fact that the Shaping Urban Futures course, the MOOC, is now curated by the SDG Academy of the United Nations. And so welcome to anybody who is coming through that route today, and please spread the word. We want to leave space here for questions. So I'm going to ask colleagues to be very, very sharp and maybe cut their answers to a sentence or two, and please put your questions in the chat, and we'll give you a chance to come back to the individuals you've heard, or the panel as a whole. But so the final question, though, is to the panel is, maybe if you could just say very, very quickly each how you think the work that we've done relates to how we think about research and the SDGs more generally in the context of the real challenges that the world faces in the wake of the pandemic, in the face of the climate crisis. Andy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so just very briefly, I think that the link between research, SDGs, and making a difference, we can see it several ways, but just in the interest of time, the SDGs were informed as much by research as much as research itself is informing how the SDGs are being implemented. And I think that is a key strength of this type of transdisciplinary, integrated, holistic international research, is that we get to try and understand how exactly to make a difference on the ground in the context of a longer research tradition that has resulted in the SDGs, and for which the SDGs are now as much an aspiration and a guiding principle for future research.
Peng Zhen and then Gautam, one sentence or two each, very quickly.
Oh, very quickly, I would say, yes, I agree with that. And Andrew, yes, SDG is very good research topics for researchers from different worlds, because this is when our urban planet become the family for each of us. We need to think about globally, and we need each of our researchers to contribute to these goals of SDGs for me.
Gautam and then Juan Carlos, maybe.
I mean, for me, I think the key part of the research is to think about how to link different SDGs with each other. I think to me, it's the overlaps, the question of whether these are and or goals, and prioritization, and the virtuous cycles, and also the sort of more difficult negative cycles of how they pick each other up or put each other down. So for me, the real question is, how do you stitch multiple SDGs and hold on to them together instead of letting them sit in their different colored boxes?
Different boxes, crossing boxes. And Juan Carlos.
So 3 sentences. SDGs are mainly localized in cities. Cities are very highly complex systems. So science and research is the tool that is going to allow you to understand a complex system and generate robust solutions for those challenges in cities.
Brilliant, thanks, Juan. Which actually leads me very nicely into Sue. Do you want to say something, Sue, about how you think all of this kind of work feeds into how we think globally about the planet in the context of and where the urban sits in the context of the SDGs and sustainability there?
So Peak Urban was really conceived in the wake of the passage of the SDGs and the acknowledgement that cities were going to be a central element of the 2030 agenda. it's very clear that we are not going to succeed on the SDG 11 or indeed some of the other SDGs and the spaces in between them. But what we hoped to have through PEAK was the capacity to understand how far we'd got, where we'd gone wrong, and what we might have to do going forward. And I think it's precisely by recognizing that it's in the complexities of how the SDGs work out at the local level, at the national level, and how they amalgamate at the global level that we have been trying to shift the urban disposition through trying to think differently about cities and to create a disposition that is normative, analytical, and operational at a whole bunch of different scales. And I think that was always the ambition of PEAK. How well we get there rests entirely on the people who have become PEAK either directly through participating in it or participating in some of its programs like the MOOC, and adopting that slightly wider reading of the city. So I think it's been really fundamental. And as I say, it's not to laud the SDGs as the only way of thinking about the city, but one that I think provides us with a platform for a comparative dialogue.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. Which we now open up space for questions. So please put them in the chat if you want to raise any points. We start with a question from Suleiman from Burkina Faso. Suleiman says, in Africa, and the part of Africa where I know most, in Western Africa, there's been a great delay in urbanization because of poor road channels, poor building design, etc. Do you think this could be integrated into modern design, or do we need to destroy the existing and go from zero? Maybe Sue and Andy might be the people to come back on this to begin with, but others might want to come in. But Andy, did you want to start? And Sue come next?
Sure, I can give it a stab. Thank you very much for the question. I think that one of the things that the African Centre for Cities generally, and I think PEAK Urban more broadly, has come to appreciate is the uniqueness of urbanization dynamics across the planet. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model, and this is something that Gautam also spoke to, that because there isn't a one-size-fits-all model in terms of urbanization dynamics, there's also not a one-size-fits-all model in terms of how to address urbanization challenges. Generally across the African continent, I think that you see particular formations of urbanization which are somewhat distinct, but also have echoes in other parts of the world. But that is driven by things such as poor road access, large-scale informality, a delinking of industrialization from urbanization in various ways. So it's not about saying we need to find a way of removing ourselves from that reality and starting afresh. It's about saying that there are particular challenges that need local bespoke solutions for which expertise and experience may well come from other parts of the world. But it shouldn't be the case that there is a one-size model that is dictated from one part of the world to a different part of the world. It should be about a more dialectical engagement about how to solve these particular challenges. Sue, I don't know if you want to come in there.
No, okay. The next question we've got is from Apana Prakash, which is, they would like to know why governments view development through the lens of the economy, but not in terms of the natural resources they contain. And would preservation efforts be given more importance if we add economic value to it? Maybe I could just put in one point from myself, which is, I think, Apana, that's an incredibly important point. One of the things that we tried to talk about in PEAK Urban is that the regimes of valuation, through how we measure different valuations of things in the city, whether it's environmental valuation or whether it's economic or social valuation, is incredibly important, but also how we find them either commensurable or incommensurable, how we join them up in different ways is actually quite challenging. But maybe I could turn to Gautam to answer the question more directly. How do we balance those environmental demands and the economic? Gautam, do you think?
Well, I was actually going to say what you said about different regimes of valuation, but so let me add to that. I think that it is, Aparna, I see your question in the Q&A. I think it is really important to be serious about the fact that currently these different forms of value are trade-offs and contestations. We're not in a sort of, the ability to say, if I just give a financial value to water, or to a lake or to, landslide, that it may. And I think it's very important to be adept strategically as an urban practitioner, to be able to invoke an economic argument for conservation, but to also equally insist that it is a moral and ecological and social argument at the same time. So I think we have to be, there's a real trick here, because different people value things differently. And when you start adding up balance sheets, it just depends on what you're making entries with. So I think the question I would ask is, for each of us as researchers, as citizens, the question is, how do you frame the trade-off you're willing to live with between the ecological, the economic, and the social? And how do you think other people are making those trade-offs? Because that's actually, in every society, in a particular political historical moment, those trade-offs are adding up, which is why sometimes in places you see a real move to conservation, and others you see a more growth-oriented development paradigm win out. So I think the first thing to start off is to make the terms of articulation of the trade-off clear, so that more people can make different decisions about the trade-off, because people's trade-offs and social trade-offs keep changing. They're not fixed. We've seen the needle move on the environmental question, but what could we do to make it move faster? I feel like that's the way to think about it, in addition to what might be said.
Thanks, Gautam. The next question is from a colleague in Turkey, and where obviously the catastrophe of the earthquake has featured prominently. And our colleague Etchen Honcha, apologies if that is poorly pronounced, says, I'd like to ask you a question, believing that it is related to the urban subject we're discussing. In terms of the earthquake in Turkey, it affected 11 different provinces. Many people were left homeless and cities were in shambles. The course addresses traces of the past, but how do we think about cities after a catastrophe such as an earthquake? And I guess all of us worked at a time when we had the horrors of the pandemic, which kind of reached out to all quarters of the world in a way that was catastrophic. But maybe Juan Carlos, in terms of a city like Medellin that's gone through some pretty major challenges, how do you think about rebuilding in the wake of the catastrophe like an earthquake?
I think that situation like that in Turkey and many cities in Colombia teach us about the importance of anticipating these type of situations. Having if you have a exposition of a natural hazard, it's very important to be well prepared and to use all what the science give you or can provide to be able to anticipate and be better prepared for these type of situations. Once the damage is done, like recovering from that is gonna cost way more, and it's gonna be very difficult. And that's happened. Is not currently part of our research agenda to how to deal once the damage is there. What we try to contribute is how to anticipate and be better prepared for these situations. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to pick around some of the questions, so I'll try and get through the ones that are on there. But there's a simple one, maybe for that Neve would be best to come to in a way, which is says, if we talk about the compact city, when is density good and when is the city too dense?
Would be a simple question with a non-simple answer.
Sorry, I think some of these questions are well formed. They put everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of, let's say, the urban scaling literature tries to look at the sort of, let's say, spillover effects, right? So you know, what are the sort of like, I guess, returns to scale, right? So you find in much larger cities and much denser cities, you have an excess of innovation. So you see the number of patents rising, you know, massively more than proportionately to size, right? And so, but then of course you see the number of crimes increasing, etc., right? So there's an element of balancing those two things. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to the question, but there's certainly research in that direction that tries to look at, as you get more denser and cities become larger, what are the sort of costs versus benefits. So I suggest it's a literature that comes out of the Santa Fe Institute, started by Geoffrey West and later Louise Betancourt, and it's a very interesting literature that tries to balance those two things. So that's something I recommend the asker look at.
Fantastic. Thank you. I will try and get through the questions. We'll overrun slightly. So those people who can stay on, we'll carry on until about 10 past the hour London time. And I know in India, there's a half-hour difference, so it's kind of 10 past the half hour. Another simple question, please keep your mind on logging in. A lot of this material is online through the course, but also through the Peak Urban website. But one for Sue, I guess, is how can we embrace the One Health approach in attainment of the SDGs, especially thinking about sustainable cities? From Ndabarima Dadino.
Yeah, great question. For those of you who don't know what One Health is, it comes in a way out of the health domain, trying to move away from a kind of narrow disease-based understanding of disease to incorporate links between environmental processes, social determinants of health, and other ways of thinking. And it's been really productive in shifting the discussion about health. But implicit in your conversation is that there are urban dynamics. And of course, that's absolutely true. And the One Health community has struggled, I think, to think about the specificity of the urban. In other words, what difference do cities make to health? And what difference does health make to how we think about the city? And so it's in that nexus, I think, that there's a really productive dialogue going on. Happily, WHO at the moment is quite open to some of those discussions and thinking about what that might mean for all the courses that they put in place for training people. So I think the more one probes that, speaks that, pushes for that, and holds this tension, and thinks about the city in health terms, which is something we used to do a lot, slums, cholera, tuberculosis, all those kinds of things. We do much, much less now, even though a city like Cape Town still has the highest TB incidence in the world, clearly related to urban conditions. Air pollution is a fundamental issue. So pushing that interface and trying to think it through, absolutely crucial. So yeah, do it.
One for you, Pungjan, I think maybe from an anonymous attendee who says, how can research on cities and the urban redirect capital and investment from growth and hypergrowth to actually focus on sustainable growth, and that innovation could become more socially relevant? These questions are very easy to answer in one or two sentences, of course, I have to say, but Pungjan, have a go.
Yeah, I think this
great questions from people. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a very big question. It's I would say at a different stage, you need to make a trade-off between economic and nature. And because firstly, in early stage, you need economic. Everybody need food, need good, some facilities, good life. But once economic is okay, you get started for central social. Sometimes you can, achieve the goals together in the same time, but sometimes you have to trade off. But I would say, at the very beginning, we need to think about socially and also some nature-based solutions at the very beginning. But I would, in a different stage, take the different solutions. But we need to think about sustainability. But practically, it's we need a trade-off. We need a trade-off. Yes, that's from me.
Thank you. And a lot of our colleagues are doing work on what the climate crisis means and how cities can both adapt to it and mitigate the impacts of cities on climate change itself. But I guess the African Centre for Cities are doing a lot of work. So I guess for Andy, there's a question maybe here, which is with regard to extreme weather conditions, how are cities being prepared to face such uncertainty? What are the structural and non-structural measures being taken proactively by city governance in this regard? Any illustrations would be welcome. That's from Tushar Pradhan.
Sure, I can respond to that. And I think it's also worth reframing that question slightly. So it's not simply about being able to address adverse weather events in the context of climate change. It's also about what cities can do to actually achieve climate targets. So an example from some of the work that actually leads on from some of the peak work that we did, and particularly the work that we did with CSP, the City Support Program, more recently has been work with the City Support Program and also with the World Bank to put forward for South Africa as a whole what a just urban transition will look like. So this is because South Africa has, particularly through its Presidential Climate Commission, really driven forward certain ideas around being able to achieve climate targets and also being able to make sure that cities themselves are resilient to potential climate shocks. And the focus here really is on cities. I mean, it's called a just urban transition. And so the ACC, in collaboration with the CSP, has put forward a policy paper specifically on this. And to answer the question in a roundabout way, it's a very tricky question to answer because there are various forms of justice which you have to take into account in the context of making sure that, say, the impacts of climate change aren't overrepresented on lower socioeconomic groups, but also that particular types of industry, for example, mining or extractive industries, when those shift to be able to enable a just transition, that the people that are affected by that aren't necessarily going to be left without recourse for retraining or for other skills development. So it's a more holistic answer, I think. It's not simply about climate resilience. It's actually about what cities can do to reduce climate change itself.
Neve, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, just to follow up on a slightly complementary track. So I'm also working with a distinct World Bank team, and what they're interested in is understanding where in global cities there are sort of infrastructural vulnerabilities. And of course, there's a huge lack of data, right? So in many cities, we don't even really know where population is distributed. We don't really know where jobs are. There's no such thing as, very detailed, government data on this type of thing. We often know what the street network looks like, but we often don't really know much about how people travel in the city. And so this team, in collaboration with some of my own researchers, are using kind of new novel methods to try to both understand and predict where population and employment are located, what are the kind of common travel trajectories of people. And so we can look at what types of, where in the road network, the public transport network are vulnerable to things like flooding. So we have pretty good predictive maps of which areas in the city are susceptible to flooding at different time intervals. So what's likely to experience a flood in the next 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. And so if we overlay these different data sources together, some of them are more concrete than others, but we can get a pretty good picture of who's affected, which parts of the various infrastructure networks are affected. And it's those maps that the World Bank infrastructure teams are then using in order to make sort of recommendations and have discussions about investments and, which parts of the networks would make sense to put more money into to shore up. So there's definitely ongoing work, particularly in the data pipeline, because that's a sort of key constraint in many places where, we need to kind of improve our understanding of how people move and where they live and work in order to make good predictions.
Thanks, Steve. I'll try and answer one question very quickly from Niyati Berwal about what role legislation plays in protecting historical sites. And I guess one thing I'd say we take away from our work across the range of countries we've worked in, that thinking about the city that you have and building from that city is incredibly important, which is why legislation is important to protect historic sites. But it's also important to kind of think analytically about how you work with the fabric of the city that you have, rather than thinking that you can just knock it all down and start again the whole time, because the environmental impacts of doing so are so enormous. There's a question for Gautam, maybe from an anonymous attendee, that's saying, I think it was, can cities be converted into can old cities along the same lines be converted into smart cities in a noisy democracy like India? And are there examples globally? I don't know whether that's a one-liner. And then we'll try and wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes after that.
Well, I mean, I'll say the first thing is that I should hope that most democracies are noisy. I think it would be very, very ironical for a democracy to be quiet, very suspicious, I would say. So I think I understand where this question is coming from. Sometimes contestations and democratic contestations can make one feel that sort of singular solutions are not being able to be implemented at scale. But on the question of smart cities, I think the real question for me is this. The idea of a city being smart is a relationship to not just a kind of modernity and technology, right? You want to be forward-looking, but I'd like to go to the core of what it's about. It's about a city that works well and knows itself. Right? I think that if I think about smartness as an attribute of self-awareness, of an intelligence, of a city that knows what its people need at that point, then I think that actually the disagreement I have with the way smart cities are imagined in India is that smart city imagination relies too heavily on not learning from what actually happens in our cities now to root our smartness and how to do better with what we know. It relies too much on the idea that smartness lies in something outside known intelligence, a technical fix, a quick thing that will wipe away the politics and the noisiness of democracy. But the noisiness of democracy is also what keeps our cities equitable. Without that, there would be gains and losses and erasures that we would not even know. So I think it's pivotal for us to say, democracy does not hinder the possibility of futurity and technology. Quite the opposite. The question is to really take seriously our democratic and local realities and begin with where we know. And I'll ask, if the attendee happens to be Indian, I'll ask them to do a thought experiment. Translate the word smart into any Indian language. There is never a positive translation of smart in Indian languages. It translates as clever and wicked and canny and scheming. The words for wisdom and wise and considered are not smart. So there's a very particular lesson there in the fact that our language has avoided smartness. My mother used to always say, don't be too smart. It was never said positively. So I think that we need futurity and modernity and technology in our cities, but we need to sort of say that the answers to a lot of good knowledge in our cities are in our practices. We need to look at them with a slightly less jaundiced eye, not to try and transform them or replace them, but build upon them and secure them.
I'll try and wrap up just a few points, and apologies for not kind of coming to these individually, and the questions have been asked. Just to say that I think educational needs are incredibly important universally for all people of all backgrounds, all ages, and all genders. That leadership in cities is important, and in terms of how we balance nature, rivers, and urban change, it is, I think, we need to develop that disposition that understands there are different values and valuations, and we have trade-offs between them. So when we're thinking about environmental, social, and economic sustainability, we need to make those trade-offs visible to think about the balances. And a final question, which I'm going to put Sue on the spot for, which is from Rafael Prieto Curiel, is if there was one thing you could go back to and rethink starting again, what might it be?
Rafael would have to have had different people around the table writing the proposal, and perhaps to have included some of the people who then became the participants in it. I think Neve spoke about the fact that it was designed as a very open-ended program, and I think it was born of a moment in the immediate post-SDG period. And perhaps we could have put forward a sharper, more kind of guided tramlines on what we would and wouldn't include. But I think that would have been difficult to do, constructing a project as we did for a funder's objective and without knowing the detail of who would be present. And I think what I would have done differently, and I think everybody would probably agree with that, is to have left a little bit more time and opportunity at the end phase of the project to synthesize work and to bring material together. And that to some extent is happening informally. People are still collaborating and writing. There is material that will still come out with a peak brand, and hopefully a peak disposition will endure. But I think that there are some very concrete opportunities to think through the really big debates. AI and the urban, what is urban science? How do we deal with kinds of polycrises that are here that we might have been able to deal with even more effectively had we had time to synthesize using everybody from across the teams that were there. But I suppose my provocation would be to say perhaps we can do that anyway.
Many thanks. So we set out to try and help make cities smarter about how they think about their own futures through both working with people on the ground, through actually thinking about young people who would see the city differently and making that change, but also in producing research where, in answer to many of the questions, how we think about sustainability is through our different lenses, actually trying to understand the economic, the social, and the environmental through those different regimes of valuation. I think if these things were easy, we wouldn't be talking about them, but if they weren't important, we wouldn't try. And I think in that spirit, I just say thank you to all the panel. Please do share the course. The course is on Coursera. It's on the UN SDG Academy. Please visit the Peak Urban website if you want. There's something like 300 over 300, I think, publications available either by hyperlink or directly downloadable. There is material available on India, Africa, Latin America, and China on individual reports, as well as the report that is a global report. And please keep in contact and join the MOOC. So the final thanks is to not just our producers in Bangalore, but also to yourselves as an audience. We hope you've gained something from the event today. Please join the next webinar, which will be next month, and there'll be more details of that to come, and there'll be webinars in the future, as well as revisiting and updating of the readings that go on the course itself over the next 6 to 8 weeks. Many thanks, everybody, and hopefully see you again soon. Take care.